Good afternoon. I'm Len Hochberg, the U.S. coordinator of the Mackinder Forum. Our speaker today is Ioannis Kotoulas. He was a PhD in history and a PhD in geopolitics. He is adjunct lecturer in geopolitics at the University of Athens, guest lecturer at State Department National Foreign Affairs Training Center, Hellenic National Defense School, and Hellenic Army Law School. He has been a visiting lecturer at Tbilisi State University, a guest lecturer at National Intelligence University, Deakin University, Leipzig University, Tsinghua University, among many other institutions. He is an academic advisor of Foreign Affairs Institute Athens and a member of the Council of International Relations Greece. His analyses have appeared in numerous journals and newsletters. His books include Classical Geopolitics in Modern Greece in 2026, Geopolitics of the War Against Ukraine in 2024, and History of Greek Geopolitics 2021, and History and Geopolitics of Modern Greece 2019. The Mackinder Forum is delighted to have him address the issue, Geopolitics of the War Against Ukraine. And with that, please begin.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here today and address the Mackinder Forum. I would like to thank Mr. Hochberg and all the team at Mackinder Forum. I'm a historian, so my presentation will focus on and especially I like a macrohistorical outlook. I'm a fan of the French School of Analysis, so I believe in the importance of geography, of demography, and culture to understand international relations. So my presentation will focus on these aspects. So first, I will talk a bit about the methodological background. The presentation will use classical geopolitics and neoclassical realism. Then I will talk a bit about Russian revisionism. I will not delve too much into the legal aspects of Russian revisionism. I will talk a bit about the historical revisionism Russia, concerning Ukraine, concerning World War II. And then I will focus, let's say, the core of the presentation on Russian strategic goals, which I distinguish into the grand strategy goals, the political goals, the demographic goals, and the territorial goals. I consider the demographic and the territorial goals as being the most important aspects of the Russian invasion. Then we can talk a bit about scenarios, what will happen, and we will have some conclusions. So, of course, a map to locate this in our minds. Geography is very important, of course. Technology may advance or alter the course of war, but still, currently, the winter period is as much valid as a parameter of the war, even today, with all the technology. The pace of the operation is not the same as in the spring or in the summer. So we can see that Ukraine is the largest country in Europe, except Russia. So this geography, vast flatlands, especially in the south. So we have this in our mind. So we begin with classical geopolitics, of course. Sir Halford Mackinder advocated the creation, he talked about the notion of heartland, of course, and to contain the heartland power, which in this case is Russia, he advocated the creation of strategic bridgeheads on the Eurasian landmass that can be used to contain Russia, and of course to gain access. Back in his time, he was worrying that Russia would gain access to the sea. Today, these bridgeheads, I include some references. You shall see I have the references at the end of the presentation. So there are some references inside the text. So today, these bridgeheads are Ukraine, Poland, Finland, and the Baltics. These can be used to contain the Russian projection of power. In any case, Eastern Europe is the continental gateway into the heartland, and this is why its strategic importance is very high for Western interests, for US interests, in all this antagonism with Russia. So a bit of history. After World War I, we had this creation of independent states that actually created a sort of corridor that contained the Soviet Union. There are some there is a school of thought that believes that the Cold War did not begin in 1945, but in 1919 with a confrontation with the Soviet Union. During the interwar, all these states were too weak, and what was their fate? Either they were absorbed, like or destroyed, like Poland, or absorbed, like the Baltics. They were destroyed, like Czechoslovakia or Yugoslavia, or they joined the Axis. During the Cold War, we have the Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, which can be described or defined as the outer empire of Russia, and the inner empire was the non-Russian Soviet periphery, the Caucasus and Central Asia. So after the fall of the Eastern Bloc, Russia lost its outer empire, which protected its power core, and it also lost its inner empire. After, in the 1990s, we have the expansion of NATO, and on a strategic level, this is actually a European bridgehead of Atlantic US power, because Europe is, in essence, a periphery of the power core of North America. Today, Ukraine is a frontier state of Western geopolitical interests containing Russia. A depiction of the expanded heartland in 1919 book that includes also the closed Baltic and Black Seas, since the Allies could not infiltrate these areas. Mackinder expanded the pivot area and made it the heartland. So we can have the Spikeman, of course, believed that control of the Rimland is essential to world hegemony. Ukraine is a part of the Rimlands, and Spikeman identified three routes, one of which is Crimea and Ukraine, to control the Rimland and to be able to project power towards the heartland power. So Ukraine lies in this focal position that offers access to the heartland, and specifically to Russia's power core, because Russia is the biggest state, but its power core is located in the European part, and all this nexus, the Europe-Urals nexus. Siberia, there is a disparity between Siberia and the European part, and this route through Crimea and Ukraine was used, of course, during the Crimean War, where you had this overseas deployment by Great Britain and France, and it was also used in the anti-Bolshevik campaign during the Russian Civil War. Interesting detail, the majority of the soldiers that fought there were Greeks in the anti-Bolshevik campaign, and they fought bravely. There were no desertions like the French. So Brzezinski thought that Russian empire is not possible without Ukraine, and that the West should detach Ukraine from a Russian projection of influence or power. No Ukraine, no empire for Russia. So on a historical level, these are the entryways into the heartland. The Ukrainian plain was used by similar by the same actors, and it connects. This is the area that Mackinder, of course, identified as the point of entry in a different reverse direction from the heartland towards Europe with the nomads. But here we have the function of an attack towards the heartland. Then you have the sea routes from the Black Sea, Crimea, Ukraine. We just talked about this 1 minute ago. Of course, you have the sea route through the Arctic Ocean. This is a more difficult route, but it was used by America in the Russian Civil War. And we could distinguish a fifth route, let's say, the current bridgeheads, Finland and Sweden, the Baltics, and Ukraine. Of course, this will not be used for an invasion of Russia. Nobody wants to invade Russia, but they can be used to deter Russian aggression. So what is the historical conclusion? We could say that this great continental strategic depth of Russia as a Eurasian land empire prevails when the power core is threatened, when Russia faces invasions. The core cannot be conquered, of course, but its periphery can be shattered, as it happened after World War I and as it happened after the end of the Cold War. So, support of Ukraine is essential to contain the heartland power. So, classical and neoclassical realism. Thucydides, of course, has taught us that states act with the following motives: fear, honor, and interest. If we kind of project these three factors on Russia, we could say that fear is that they had reached a peak of power and influence back in 2022, and there were indications that from now on, Russia, especially on a demographic level, would have like a downward trajectory. So the loss of status, what will happen in the near future? And so Russia saw this window of opportunity to act back in 2022. Honor could be, we could say that honor of Thucydides terms is the desire to be recognized as equal. This is essential for states like Russia or China. A desire to be recognized as equal to the US, of course, in the international system. And interest would be the material aspect, and it has to do with demography. I will explain more about this later, and territory. So Mearsheimer, the variation of offensive realism, regards the Russian invasion as a structural reaction to NATO expansion. So this is, according to Mearsheimer, a rational choice, because in this way, Russia can achieve a buffer zone and protect its power core. Of course, we could have some objection to this interpretation, and we could say that Ukrainian membership in NATO was not imminent, it was not probable, it probably would not happen even before the invasion, and will not happen now. Russian invasion was a war of choice, and the full-scale invasion specifically was a specific choice by Russia, because Russia had two other options. I will talk more about it later. In February 2022, Russia could do had two other options. So I'm a fan of neoclassical realism. So I believe in this interaction between the structure. The structure is, of course, that NATO has expanded in Eastern Europe. So this caused a fear in Russian self-perception of security, but of course, internal factors. I believe it is a mistake to have this, let's say, abstract systemic approach that all states will act in the same manner in similar circumstances. So I believe in the power of internal factors like ideology, history, and the perceptions of elites. So especially concerning Russia, there are misconceptions regarding Ukraine, of course. They do not believe that Ukraine is an independent nation. They would consider Ukrainians to be some sort of deluded Russians, a part of the Russian world. And you have this concerning the Russian political system. When you have these autarchic systems, there's not so much freedom to express different opinions. I mean, among the military personnel or the policymakers. So Russia went on with the invasion because it wanted to believe in its own propaganda. I think it believed in its own propaganda. So they thought, for example, that Ukrainians in Eastern Ukraine, which are to a large degree Russian-speaking, they would welcome Russian invasion. So this is like when Hitler invaded Russia on the belief that Russia was too weak, not so advanced. Sometimes you get trapped into what you believe about the rival. I think this happened to a degree with the invasion in Ukraine because they thought that they could win very easily. So Russian imperialism, of course, is a macrohistorical feature, and Russia as a land empire has been the most expansive state in modern history. It has expanded from its core in a European part around Moscow and northern part of Russia to reach the Pacific. This has to do, in my view, with these aspects, the geophysical. When you have a lack of physical borders, you have to be more aggressive to control the territory. This is the case with nomads, with the Mongol Empire, or with nomads in general. There are excellent studies by this scholar Kazanov on the nomads, and he makes this connection that nomads have to be more violent than sedentary civilizations because they have to control the vast territories, and they always have to have this warlike mentality. There is also a cultural aspect. There is this norm of a Eurasian land empire, whether it be the Mongol Empire, whether it be China, or is it Russia, that has this tendency to expand. Then, of course, you have Russian messianism, which is an important aspect. You have the Orthodox messianism. We Greeks are also Orthodox, but the Russian Orthodox Church is something different. It has been influenced by the climate, the topography, by the culture of the Russian people. So it's more messianic, more back in 19th century. Dostoevsky thought that Holy Russia will save the world, that the West is decadent, and all these tropes keep reappearing in a different form in Russian thought, like with Dugin. And then you have communist, of course, messianism. I remember there's a very interesting article by, I think, Murray Rothbard about how communism is actually the continuation of the Christian faith with, the party substituting the church, the lost paradise, the pre-capitalist is the pre-capitalist mode of living, and the final and the second coming is the communist world. Anyway, on a geopolitical level, the heartland, of course, this is classical geopolitics. Russia is the heartland power that projects power towards the coastal periphery and tries to create buffer zones to protect its power core. What is the peculiar aspect of Russia and Europe is that Eastern Europe is close to its power core. So in Russian perception, they want to create these buffer zones. According to hegemonic stability theory, states tend to be more aggressive when they foresee the decrease of their strength. So they try to grasp this, the circumstance, to seize the window of opportunity. So I think that happened with Russia in 2022 in combination with the US hasty withdrawal from Afghanistan. And of course, wars tend to increase international status. It may sound cynical, but it's true. Russia has no considerable soft power. It has a soft power in relation to religion in certain countries that are Orthodox, but it cannot antagonize the West in this aspect. So Russia relies more on hard power. And there is this, I have this reference to Karaganov. He was one of Putin's, in the close circle of Putin. So he wrote a very interesting article. I have the link at the end, just 2 days before the invasion. And he's saying that we have no soft power, we admit it. We have to use our hard power to subdue Ukraine and to gain status. Just 2 days before the invasion, probably he knew about it. So it's a very interesting perception of how Russia sees its bid to gain status. Russian tactics have worked, of course, in Armenia. Okay, Armenia is now in a kind of balance, tries to rebalance towards the West. It has worked definitely in Georgia. I have lived in Georgia for like 2 or 3 years as a visiting lecturer at Tbilisi, and I saw that how Russia was able to use social issues to infiltrate the society. So Russia wants to be perceived as an equal, so it uses hard power. Just a quick note on legal revisionism. Russia, of course, violated the international consensus on inviolability of borders with its invasions, the first invasion in Georgia, then the first one in Ukraine, and then the second one. I have to say that, just a brief comment, the Western intervention in Kosovo was a mistake. It was a violation of territorial integrity of Serbia. The West should have done, I think, something different, like an autonomous status for Kosovo or something else. Definitely not a cessation of territory. Anyway, Russia uses this principle of equal and indivisible security that was formulated during Cold War, and according to Russia, this means that Ukraine cannot be in NATO because if Ukraine joins NATO, then our security as Russians is being diminished. So Russia translates this, perceives this in a negative sense, not in the positive, proactive dimension of I will join any alliance I want. It says, no, Ukraine cannot join NATO because this is a problem for us. So this is a kind of distortion of the notion, but Russia has used this in its official memoranda. It was used officially in December 2021, and again by Lavrov just a few days before the invasion. And of course, Russia promotes this notion of spheres of influence, which was predominant in 19th century Europe. But Russia tries to interpret this differently, says we'll keep our own sphere of influence. America, the US can keep its own, China, perhaps a third one. So historical revisionism, this is interesting. Russia promotes this notion of a tripartite pan-Russian, all Russian nation, where Russians are the main element, of course. Then you have Belarusians and you have Ukrainians, which they would call small Russians. So this is a 19th century terminology, and it's used in a propaganda manner after the 1990s. And of course, Russia uses other terms like compatriots, those Russians that live outside the Russian Federation, but they belong to another concept, the Russian world. So this is interesting. Why? Because this was used, I talk about this a bit later, in the invasion in Georgia. We will protect our compatriots in Georgia. So the Russian world, of course, which does not include simply the post-Soviet space. Sometimes it expanded even to include the Tsarist Empire. This is the Russian world. It is used geopolitically, but more in a sense of a greater sphere of culture and influence. Then you have a divided nation, which is a very dangerous notion again, that the Russian nation was divided after 1991. It is in Ukraine, and we have to liberate or protect or whatever. And of course, Novorossiya, which was the part north, the coastal part of Ukraine. It was used when Catherine the Great took the northern part of the Black Sea and gained access to the Black Sea. They use this term, but now Russia uses in a propaganda term to denote the southern and eastern part of Ukraine, but not Crimea. Okay, this is a depiction of the tripartite all-Russian, pan-Russian nation, Russia in the middle, Ukraine on the left, and Belarus on the right. This is 1905. And again, Novorossiya, of course, that would be the dream goal of Russia, to turn Ukraine into a landlocked state and completely to have it dependent on Russia. And this was a variation of its strategic goal. So the Russian propaganda would say that Ukraine is not, they have used such terms and expressions like a historical mistake, a manufacture of the Soviet era, and so on. Putin has written, or somebody close to Putin written this essay on the unity of Russians and Ukrainians in the summer of 2021. The decision to invade Ukraine was taken probably in August or early September after the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. So there's also this confusion between Russian-speaking, who is Russian-speaking, and who is the Russians on an ethnic level. Ukraine, of course, was widely Russian-speaking. I have friends in Ukraine, in Odesa, who are Russian-speaking. They told me we do not use Russian anymore after what Russia has done to us. And Russian was a status language. Ukrainian language was not used so much. The 1991 census had these results. The ethnic Russians were 70% located in Crimea and Donbass, but Russian speaking is something completely different. So in propaganda terms, in my country and other countries, they tend to confuse these two levels of population and try to present a distorted image. Oh, these are the results of the referendum for independence 1991. And you can see, of course, there is the difference between Western and Eastern Ukraine, slight difference, of course. But every region, even Crimea, voted in favor of independence. So the historical image of Ukraine, to your right, the image is from 1954, when we had this anniversary of the 300 years of the Pereyaslav Treaty. You have the Russian on the left and the Ukrainian on the right, with the Cossack style. So there are these different phases of how Russia treated Ukraine and how Russia saw Ukraine. During the early Soviet era, there was this period of the so-called indigenization, when the Soviet regime would allow the national identity of Ukraine and other nations in the Soviet Union, but they would keep the leadership of the party, of the Communist Party of Ukraine. He would always be Russian. So you would have a Communist Party that was Ukrainian with many Ukrainians. And when, Ukrainian officials tried to protect their culture or their identity, there were reactions from the center. So there is this typology, the center, Moscow, Russia, trying to impose its influence on the periphery, on Ukraine, even during this period. Of course, we have the persecution and the genocide, the Holodomor, the Great Famine during the 1930s. This is when there is an intense crackdown on a Ukrainian identity. As the war was approaching, Russia needed to have good terms, to be on good terms with the Ukrainian, because it feared an invasion from Poland as well, not only from Germany. So they tried to accommodate the Ukrainian national feeling. This is when you had, of course, Crimea ceded to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. From the 1970s, you have a different trend. You have a Soviet nationalism, not Russian nationalism, but Russian speaking. We are Soviet nation, but we use Russian. Or of course, this was like an indirect Russification. From the 1980s, you have a growing Russian nationalism. Until the first wave of invasion, there was a balance, and there were appeals to the Soviet era, our coexistence, and so on. But from after the first invasion, and especially after 2022, there is a gradual demonization of Ukraine. Ukraine is presented some sort of artificial Western-tied nation that is anti-Russia, that wants to destroy Russia, that is a tool of the West, or even that it's controlled by neo-Nazis. And it's interesting to see how Russian perceptions of World War II have changed. So I distinguish these three levels, let's say. So in the post-Cold War period, USSR and collective victory, together with the Allies, we defeated the Axis. No mention, of course, of Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. The Great Patriotic War begins at 1941. Before that, we don't know what happens. The second version, the Soviet Union alone. We fought alone. Stalin is a great leader. He was a great strategist. The Molotov Pact was a great diplomatic move. So we fooled Hitler, we fooled the West, we fooled everyone. So Russia is the hegemonic nation. Ukraine is still mentioned under Russian, guidance, let's say. But the third version, which is now dominant in Russia, Russia alone defeated, won the World War II. Europeans were collaborators of Nazis or crypto Nazis or whatever. There is no mention of Ukraine. They will stress, some aspects. They will say they collaborated with Germany. They would even erase Europe. Europeans did not offer any meaningful resistance to Axis. Especially France or the Baltics are portrayed as collaborators. There is, of course, no mention of the division of Poland and even erasure of the US. No mention of the US Lend-Lease Act. So what is the conclusion today? Ukrainian Europeans are actually anti-Russian, pro-Nazis, and there are some, even from the foreign ministry of Russia that says Europe has again fallen under the shadow of Nazism by opposing Russia and so on. So strategic goals, what did Russia wanted to do with the invasion? I think I can distinguish these three aspects. First of all, there was this greater Russia, let's call it ethnic nationalism project until the invasion of 2022. Of course, they had occupied Crimea, but they had not. They were backing, of course, the insurgency in Donbass, but they had not annexed Donbass. The plan was to make Ukraine a confederate state where Donbass parts controlled by Russia would have a veto power not only on internal matters, on matters of identity, on how to accommodate, the Russian ethnic elements, but they would have veto power over foreign policy of the whole of Ukraine. That would make Ukraine a satellite of Russia. That was the initial plan, and that was Russia's goal during the invasion. Then you have, of course, the maximalist version, when I believe Russia, and this is interesting, there were some leaks in the press about this plan. Russia, what did it want to achieve with the invasion, with a full-scale invasion on the whole territory of Ukraine? They would make this confederacy of 200 million Eastern Slavs, Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians unite together. This would be a triumph for Russia. It would be a revival of the Soviet Union in its European form. And the Slavic demographic core of the Soviet Union would present itself again in a new form. This would be a watershed moment. So, of course, what Russia describes as demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. What is the goal today of Russia? Of course, this is subjective. We could say that a minimalist version would be that Ukraine does not become a NATO member. Ukraine has accepted this now, and that Russia keeps Crimea and it keeps Donbass. That would be the minimalist goal. The maximalist goal, of course, no NATO, but also what the Russians would want, and the jure recognition of all the occupied territories, stretching from the Kherson Oblast up to Donbass, and on a second level to reinstate a pro-Russian regime in Kyiv. So try to draw back Ukraine into its sphere of influence. We can move to the next slide. So I will go now back to the choices, and this is why the notion that the invasion was a systemic response is erroneous, because Russia had three choices. First of all, just the days before the invasion, what could Russia have done? The minimalist choice. It could have used its military to, the army was gathered across the borders with Ukraine to force Ukraine into accepting a greater autonomy of Donbass. So that was the original plan, you remember, 2014 to 2021-22, where Donbass will have a veto power over the whole of the foreign policy of Ukraine. the minimalist version. The moderate, let's say moderate, okay, version would be to go what everyone thought Russia would do, right? They would go just into Donetsk and Luhansk, and they would recognize these two regions as independent polities, as happened with Abkhazia and South Ossetia in Georgia, when they recognized these two occupied parts as, states. And in let's say, a variation of this scenario, the two polities would join the Russian Federation, as it actually happened in September of 2022, but the rest of Ukraine would not be invaded. In this case, we would have, of course, again, Western sanctions, but the response would not be so great. And perhaps over time, the West would abandon Ukraine like it did to a great degree after 2014. The maximalist version, which Russia actually chose, was full-scale invasion to install a puppet regime during it invaded the whole of territory of Ukraine, and the political aspect was to create this tripartite union with Russia and Belarus. The trigger was probably, that's of course just a hypothesis, the hasty US withdrawal from Afghanistan that created this image that the US is weak or disorganized or whatever. So probably, that's my interpretation, of course, of many other analysts, that in August, sometime in August or early September, Russia decided on a full-scale invasion, not just the two first versions. And of course, Russia underestimated both the response of the West, but mostly, and we have to always emphasize that, the resistance of Ukrainians, because for like 3 to 4 months, Ukraine fought alone. Western help began to come to Ukraine from May and June 2022. Ukraine could have lost the war if it had, accepted the terms of Russia, but it stood its ground. So now I distinguish the goals of Russia. First of all, the grand strategy of goals. What did Russia wanted to achieve? Turn Ukraine into a buffer zone to shield the power core that is located in the European part from the West. The European part, the Russian power core and its demographic and economic seat of power is in the European part, in this zone extending from St. Petersburg to Moscow to Volgograd. So this is, according to the Russian perception, what it wanted to protect. Of course, they would try to turn Ukraine into a neutral buffer state. And if you see the map, what Russia actually now is under Russian occupation is this strip, this land bridge between Donbass up to Crimea. That is the goal, to create a contiguous land corridor linking Donbass to Crimea, and in a maximalist scenario, even to Transnistria through Odesa. What is another goal? Of course, if Russia had succeeded in its invasion, NATO and the US would be discredited. European Union would face internal tensions. It would be a big defeat, especially you have a lot of countries in the European Union try to disengage from, there would be more pro-Russian, more pro-friendly. And Russia would have increased status, not only generally on the international level, but especially in the context of its cooperation with China. So this is from a report by the Estonian intelligence service. This was published in December 2021. So it's the monthly report of the Estonian intelligence service, and it shows what Russia considers to be its buffer zone. It's Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova. The part that Russia does not want to have any Western influence and uses as a buffer zone to protect its power core, as you can see located in the hinterlands. So the political goal: a state union, some sort of confederacy of the three Eastern Slavic nations. That could be a sort of upgrade of the existing state union of Russia, Belarus, This could be a great triumph of Russia. It would be a revival of the USSR in a way. There were some leaks in Russian media of this plan. It's interesting that there was a series of articles published just 2 days after the invasion, and they have the same motives. That means they were prepared before the invasion. That says that Russia has regained its rightful place, that we make this confederacy, and so on. And some of them were later retracted. So this is interesting. There was this plan in place. Of course, things evolve and goals get adjusted. It would be a combination of this tripartite pan-Russian nation and even a nostalgia of the Soviet times. And as a motive, what do we see? That Russia does not allow certain post-Soviet states, Belarus, Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, to escape their attachment. They want to keep them close. The Baltics, here's an interesting aspect that we could discuss. There's this, why did Soviet Union accept actually that the Baltics left? Because the Baltics are different. Russia cannot claim an ethnic or cultural affinity with the Baltics. They are different on an ethnic, on a religious level. So there is this dimension, I think, is worth looking into. That's how Russia, projects this image of affinity to Orthodox populations and so on. So the demographic goal, and I consider the demographic and the territorial goals to be the most important of the invasion. Russia has a great demographic problem in contrast to the US. Its population is projected to be less in the future. They have great subfertility and no immigration. So it's the projections, of course, are scenarios, but the medium projection by the United Nations is that Russia would be 130 million and even less at the end of the century. So the plan was to strengthen the Slavic demographic core. It's interesting that when the Soviet Union was dissolved, and Ukraine, there was some discussion, would Ukraine continue to be a part of the Soviet Union? Because Kazakhstan, there were thoughts to have this continuation along with Kazakhstan. And since Ukraine refused to do that, Russia could not do it without the Slavic demographic aspect of Ukraine. And there are interesting comments by Yeltsin to Bush back then. He said that without Ukraine, we cannot balance, Russia would turn into some sort of Christian Islamic, hybrid. So there is this danger. This is very interesting. That's this aspect. And there is, of course, demographic engineering in occupied Ukraine. There is a Russification. There is forceful removal of children. All these are crimes against humanity. And this is a typical imperial Russian practice. In the past, Russia has used this many times against Greeks, against Germans, against the Tatars. So the territorial goal, conquer Donbass, the minimalist goal, and the southern Ukraine, because southern Ukraine has this fertile black soil lands. Ancient Greek historian Herodotus was the first to talk about this, how the land of Scythia back then, of Ukraine, is so fertile that it flows, the fruits and all the products are made by the road. So southern Ukraine has very fertile soil land, and Donbass is, of course, industrial area. This last comment is interesting. Russia seeks to be autonomous in the international system. And I believe Russia and China, but Russia was probably the first to realize this aspect on the international system, that you have to be autonomous. And it is very important, even food production, to be able to confront your enemy during war crisis, to not be dependent on supply chains. And there's this very interesting study by Collingham. It concerns World War II it tries to examine World War II under this prism. This is what's on January 20, the situation on the ground. As you can see, Russia has not made any real progress after it occupied this land strip. It makes some local progress, but at a very high cost. It sacrifices people to gain a very few acres of land. So we can say that Ukraine has managed to keep Russian aggression at a standstill at a very terrible cost. There was this, anecdotal calculation that if a snail had left Donbass, it could already have reached Vienna. And Russia has advanced slower than a snail, anyway, after 4 years. So, scenarios. Okay, this is pretty subjective, of course. A lot of parameters to take in. Let's try to generalize some aspects. 2 hypotheses: human losses, economic power. Human losses, Russian victory. Why? Because Russia has a bigger pool and it can sustain greater casualties. Ukraine tries to control this, the loss of population by drafting people over 25, and Russia tries to control this by using mercenaries from North Korea, from African countries, and avoids drafting major urban centers. They mainly draft from ethnic minorities or from poor regions. Of course, all societies have a limit of casualties. I don't remember the exact amount. There was this very interesting study about World War II, and it showed how many people Germany and Japan lost. There's this limit, like it is very low, like 3 or 4% on the low, of population. But beyond that, societies cannot bleed too much. Interestingly, Ukraine, the new defense minister, if I remember correctly, has set a goal to try to reverse this, to kill 50,000 Russians per month. So to try to make this Russian advantage, let's say, to try to even the odds by using drones mostly. So the hypothesis of economic power, the West wins, West and Ukraine. But this, of course, means that the United States and the European Union stay united on how they see the war in Ukraine, and this is not so certain. Of course, this is a long-term scenario. The negative effect on the Russian economy, it is there. Russian gain from oil is down 25% this year, and there are many problems. It has gone, more slowly than anticipated, than it was thought, but there is a real cost on the Russian economy. What works against this? That there are many economic centers right now, China, India, that help Russia, or they transfer technology. There are companies in Turkey, in the Arab states, even in Taiwan, even in Europe, even in the US, some companies supposedly that send technology to Russia. And if the US stops the economic pressure on Russia, what happens then? The US has from time to time reduced the flow of intelligence to Ukraine to try to force Ukraine into some sort of compromise. So all this has to be taken into account. And again, I will begin with the last comment. What is victory right now? The victory in 2026 is very different from victory in 2022. The definition of victory for both Russia and Ukraine is totally different from the start of the war. So, because the strategic goals have been redefined. Will the war continue? Right. I was just checking the internet before I joined the discussion. There are news of that there is this peace plan, and that supposedly 95% is ready. I'm not so sure it will happen. I do not believe Russia will go on with a peace plan, but that's another discussion. Anyway, the variation, the probable outcome, the war will continue. Slight changes in territorial control. Duration of wars has always been underestimated. Wars have their own dynamic. Minor changes or a general armistice along the frontier lines. Perhaps this will happen with a peace plan. Ukraine has said that it will not recognize the occupation of any part of Ukraine, including Crimea and Donbass. So we have to see how this will play out. Victory of Russia. This would happen only if the front collapsed and Russia advanced very quickly. But if it has not happened in 4 years, I do not believe it will happen now. Of course, all armies have like a breaking point, but it does not seem that Ukraine has reached this breaking point. Of course, Ukraine is realistic. It has abandoned the prospect of NATO, and what is now victory for Ukraine? What could a victory mean for Ukraine? It will be a strategic victory, not a tactical victory, because Ukraine, unfortunately, is not capable right now to regain the occupied territories. The cost is too high. Zelensky has said that in relation to Crimea mostly, but also in relation to other occupied parts. Will Ukraine join the European Union? That is also a big if. There are countries inside the European Union that do not want Ukraine. NATO, I think we can rule out. So, variations of this. Russia leaves the occupied territories, Kherson, Zaporizhia, but not Crimea and not Donbass. Or Russia keeps the expanded version of Donbass that it occupied in 2022. A historical parallel with Finland. Finland fought bravely. It lost the war, although it crushed the Soviets, at the start of the war, the Winter War, but it gave territory to the Soviet Union. It kept its independence, it remained neutral, hence Finlandization, and during the Cold War, but today is a very advanced state, it's pro-Western. So strategic endurance, patience, and a really long-term perspective. Could the Finland model be applied to Ukraine? Worst case scenario, Ukraine loses territory, Crimea, Donbass, but gets tied to the Western power core, becomes a member of the EU. Is this a victory of Ukraine? Yes, it is, because Ukraine disengages from Russia and becomes a part of the Western power core. This is an interesting. What ifs are always interesting, challenging, but they are very interesting, I think, as an experiment in history. If Russia had won in 2022, Ukraine would be a satellite state, a part of this tripartite confederacy. Russia would be a dominant power in all in all Eastern Europe. The EU would be divided. You would have a rise of pro-Russian attitudes. You would have many states that would find a balance with Russia, and not just Hungary or Slovakia, but even France, or even Germany. And Russia would have succeeded where it failed as the Soviet Union. The US would have been discredited, and Russia would use in its propaganda, oh, we protect our ethnic brethren in Donbass, we protected Assad in Syria. Assad would not have fallen if Russia had won, because in a way, the war in Ukraine has produced this spillover effect in Syria, even perhaps in Venezuela, one could say. Also, what is interesting is that Russia would have an increased status in this nexus with China, and Russia would be more pro-Russian. This, after the failures of Russia, this did not happen, and China has not some sort of disengagement. So, if Russia wins today, of course, this happens to a degree, but a lesser impact because the environment has changed. EU economy has decoupled from Russia. The US has now a decisive leadership, and it can use economy as a leverage. And military weakness of Russia has been debunked. This myth of Russia as a formidable power has been debunked, and its status has been decreased. And China has used this weakness of Russia to get oil very cheaply and to subdue Russia. And always remember that for Chinese, Russians are also Westerners, and they are the ones that have occupied Chinese territory, the area around Amur. So I'm coming to the end of the presentation. To conclude, the Russian invasion is the result of long-term factors, a combination, according to the model of neoclassical realism. You have the structure, NATO expands in Eastern Europe. Russia sees this as a threat, draws a red line with the speech of Putin at the Munich Security Conference and says, no more expansion. We consider the West to be the enemy. We intervene in Georgia. We intervene in 2008. We intervene in Ukraine 2014 and again 2022. But it's also a combination of internal aspects, ideology, how Russia sees Ukraine. But we have to remember that Russian imperialism was there during the Tsarist Empire, it was there during the Soviet Union, and it is there today. So this is the classical geopolitics aspect, a Eurasian land empire that is expansive in all directions. The US supports Ukraine. There are, of course, variations. I believe that the US will continue its support of Ukraine, but what the US actually tries to achieve is to increase the cost for Europeans, its participation, not only in economy, but also in security aspects. China supports Russia as its strategic depth, and it keeps the US off the Eastern Pacific, but it also subdues Russia. Back in the Cold War, as you know, it was Russia that was the model for everything and that exported people, experts, ideas, technology to the periphery, including China. Now it's completely reversed. Russia imports everything from China. So the West should continue and increase its support of Ukraine to weaken Russia as a hegemonic power in Europe. The economic cost for the US is very, very low in relation to what it achieves. All this talk about the reverse Kissinger. Okay, should the US detach Russia from China and keep it as a counterbalance? This makes sense, of course, to do that. But let's look a bit at the economic aspects. The trade relations between the economic relations US and Russia is just $5.4 billion. It used to be 37 before the sanctions. But look at the China-Russia trade volume. It's 245. So this that I have underlined, China achieves two things. It also weakens Russia and it keeps the US off the Indo-Pacific. But China will never sign an alliance with Russia. China will never sign an alliance with anyone. They see themselves as the geopolitical center or the cultural center of the world. They will not be drawn into any alliance with Russia. And Russia has been bogged down in a war of attrition. And a strategic victory for the West and for Ukraine is feasible when the costs shall outweigh the benefits of the invasion, like Afghanistan, when Russia will say, okay, it is not worth it to be there in Ukraine if the sanctions have hit us so hard. But this, of course, remains a long-term scenario. Oh, okay. This is my book, my book in Greek on the geopolitics of the war against Ukraine. Prologue, forward by Professor Athanasios Platias, and afterward by Jake Sotiriadis. And another slide, I think we have one more. Yeah, the references that I included. Thank you very much. I hope it was useful as a presentation. Thank you very much.